Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel today on making the case for intercultural competence in the professions. We are very fortunate to have with us three very distinguished professors of engineering, accounting, and economics, and we thank them for being here with us today. The moderator for the panel today will be Dr. Preto-Bay, who is the professor of our class Intercultural Outreach, of which I and many of you seated here today belong to. And she is also the director, she also directs the Intercultural Outreach program, which is housed here in the Kennedy Center. As introduction of myself, like he said, my name is Michelle Zabriskie. I am a biochemistry major. I'm also a mother of three and a newly transferred student to BYU. I began my education at the University of Utah, and I am now finishing it up here at BYU. I currently work in a research lab with Dr. Emily Bates, where we were recently recognized for our novel discoveries in the developmental pathway that affects palate development. My plans are to pursue a graduate degree in medicine, which brings me to this class. And my experiences as a volunteer and shadowing and interacting with patients have demonstrated that I need to be interculturally competent. And as a student in intercultural outreach, I have used course materials and our discussions to help me reflect on my own cultural values and traditions and see how they influence my decisions. And through that reflection, I've been able to better understand how other cultures would influence their decisions and their actions. Our first panelist today will be Dr. Alan Parkinson, who's a professor of mechanical engineering and currently serves as the Dean of the Ira A. Fulton College of Engineering and Technology here at BYU. The college is home to 3,600 students in 11 programs. Previous to his appointment as the Dean, he served as the Associate Dean from 2003 to 2005 and as Chair of the Mechanical Engineering from 1995 to 2001. He received his PhD and master's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana and BS and his bachelor's and MBA degree here at BYU. During his time as Dean, the college has implemented technical study abroad programs and international internships in China, Europe, India, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, and other countries, so that now about a quarter of the students that graduate from his college have a technical international experience before they graduate. He's recently conducted research on global virtual teams, where students collaborate via the internet on engineering design projects with other student teams scattered around the world. Our next panelist would be Dr. Lee Radabaugh, who is the director of the Whitmore Global Management Center in the Marriott School. His academic interests range from international accounting ethics and the accounting profession in a global context to the role of culture and institutional factors on financial reporting. Dr. Radabaugh was a visiting professor to ESAN, it's a long name that hopefully Dr. Radabaugh can give to us, in Lima, Peru, and Glasgow University. Additionally, he's co-authored several publications and authored books as well. And Dr. Scott Bradford is an associate professor of economics at BYU. Dr. Bradford is an international economist who researches and teaches various aspects of globalization. Most recently, his research has focused on migration and the repercussion of rich nation barriers to immigration on global poverty. Dr. Bradford has also presented at several conferences throughout the US, Asia, and Europe. I will now turn the time over to Dr. Preto-Bay for some initial remarks, and after her remarks, we'll have contributions of Dr. Parkinson, Dr. Radabaugh, and Dr. Bradford in that order. And we anticipate that we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answers at the end. The students of the Intercultural Outreach class will stick around until 5:50, in which you are all invited to stay as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you. It's nice to be here with you, and we're very fortunate to have such distinguished panelists. I don't think that I could have hoped for a better introduction to the topic that brings us together today as the talk that Elder Bednar gave yesterday in General Conference. He spoke about the difference between testimony and conversion, and as I was thinking about the topic for this panel, I was thinking there's also a difference between awareness and competence. And I kind of saw that those were, you can be culturally aware and you don't necessarily, you may not be culturally competent, and our objective, obviously, is that we can and should become interculturally competent, especially as it pertains to the professions. As you know, many of the global problems that we face cannot be resolved and cannot be addressed by individual nations or individuals alone. That many of our problems, social and cultural and otherwise, only can find solution through effective global cooperation. We have things like terrorism and climate change and nuclear proliferation and pandemics. And only through organized multiculturalism and multilateralism, can we ever address them. Strobe Talbot from the Brookings Institution said that mega threats can be held at bay in the crucial years immediately ahead only through multilateralism on a scale far beyond what the world has achieved to date. And so I think it's pertinent that we would have our panelists be people that we perhaps don't associate with intercultural competence at a first glance. I was explaining to, I think, Dr. Parkinson recently that I ran into a student, actually was Dr. Bradford. I gave a ride to a student on campus he was off campus, walking to campus on crutches, and I gave him a ride and we started talking, and he said, well, that's very interesting what you do, but it doesn't pertain to me because I'm a computer science major. And I thought in my head, how wrong you are. Let me tell you more about that. Anyway, we do need ingenuity, we do need focus, and we need kind of an open heart. I think that BYU is a place where we can, start to open our wings and explore in that direction. I have a couple of ideas here from I interpret for General Conference, so forgive me. When I'm in front of a microphone, I'm usually doing something other than at the Kennedy Center. But Glenn Martin, who is professor of engineering at the University of Maryland, said that the university has an important role in this area of global multilateralism, and he says that partnerships and engagement on a global platform will be embedded in the university vision and will characterize university operations for many, if not for most of its functions. He says universities must prepare the students to prosper in global careers, responsibilities, and understanding. Working around the world for you, will be similar to working around the country was for students a generation earlier. And finally, universities will increasingly engage multidisciplinary teams on great global problems. These teams are inspired by competitions, by challenges, by service projects, and by prizes, things that have in the past been associated primarily with the industry, but the university is now seen as sort of a convergence of knowledge that we can then deploy in solving world problems. So I'm very glad to turn the time over to Dr. Parkinson and to the rest of our panelists. And in the end, we will have your questions and answers.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad to be here. My name again is Alan Parkinson. I'm the Dean of Engineering and Technology here at BYU. And we were told we had 7 to 10 minutes, so I'll try and stay within that. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I call the global world of engineering. Let's see. Doesn't look like my clicker is. Okay, there we go. Okay, I want to talk to you just about a couple things. Why we call it global competence is important, and give you a few examples and what that means. And then I'll be done. So first item, I want to just mention the college mission. There are 3 bullets there. I'm just going to talk about the first one: to develop men and women of faith, character, and technical ability who will become outstanding leaders throughout the world. So you notice it talks about leadership, it talks about throughout the world. Now, okay. Couple of examples. This shows where major assemblies come from on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. This is Boeing's newest jet. Went into service about 8 months ago. It's their most successful jet that they've ever launched. But it used to be, if you built an aircraft like this, you might have parts that came from outside the United States, but most of it came from inside the United States. The different colors represent different major assemblies of this aircraft, and if you just look around, you can see it mentions Japan, Korea, Australia, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Sweden. This is truly a global product. And in fact, one of the challenges Boeing has had is managing the global supply chain. Okay, so that's a jetliner. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to need to have you advance in the back, I think. Okay. Oh. Okay. Next example. This I just pulled off the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's about 2 years old now, but they were breaking down the latest smartphone. And what was interesting to me, they were trying to see how much it actually costs to make. This is just the circuit board, this part right here, okay? So that's that little part right there. We're not looking at any of these other parts, a lot of which are made in China and Taiwan. But you have a chip here from the United States. You have the memory chips come from Samsung and Korea. The GPS receiver comes from the United Kingdom. This chip comes from Germany. This chip comes from Japan. Another chip from the United States, and a chip from Switzerland. So there's one product that has integrated circuits from 6 different countries. And it mentions a lot of other stuff comes from China, Taiwan, and it's assembled in Mexico. Okay, General Motors, I don't typically think of them as a really cutting-edge engineering company, but they employ a lot of engineers. In 2010, for the first time in its history, its largest market was not the United States, which is pretty astonishing, frankly, but it was China. And you might not have guessed this, but they sold 2.2 million vehicles in the United States, 8.4 million vehicles worldwide. 3/4 of their revenue comes from abroad. Now, I tell my students, I say, I'll buy you lunch if you can guess the 10 top markets of General Motors. Nobody's ever gotten it. You'll see it's pretty safe. Because here it is. Well, I've already told you it was China, then the United States, then Brazil, the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Italy, Russia, Mexico, but they never get Uzbekistan. Okay? Well, that's what it means if you're going to work for General Motors. This is where you sell your cars, and 3/4 of the cars you sell will be from outside the United States. So these are some examples of what I call economic imperatives. If you want to have a strong economy, you need to have a strong history of technology and innovation. But there's some other imperatives as well. This is one. A number of engineering organizations got together and listed what they call the grand challenges for engineering. These are typically international challenges. Providing abundant energy, protecting the environment, the infrastructure for 9 billion people that will be on the earth in 2050, providing for clean water, extending health technology across the globe, and protecting national security. What does this mean? Well, the National Academy of Engineering then said, if you're going to be an engineer in 2020, students graduate today would be mid-career. This is the skill set you need to have. Strong technical skills. Boy, my clicker is just not working very good here. Leadership skills. This may be communication skills. Global competence. Creativity, flexibility, ethics. So you see one of those elements, if you're going to be a great engineer, is global competence. Okay. Just mentioned, so these are the sorts of programs that go on in our college. I'm just going to mention real quickly what you're looking at in these pictures. The one in the upper right is a group of our students in China. That's the world's largest concrete pier bridge. The column that you're looking at is 2 football fields high, and at the very top is a superhighway. And in 8 miles of this superhighway, you have the world's tallest concrete pier bridge. We're looking at the world's tallest suspension bridge and the world's tallest cable-stayed bridge. So if you want to learn some good stuff about civil engineering, China is a great place to go. They not only study these structures, they get to meet the designers. People sitting here on the steps are with a group of international students, including BYU students, at a design immersion experience at the National University of Singapore. Fiskars, these are a group of students studying international product design. This year they studied it in the Scandinavian countries. And here's another group in China looking at the effect of globalization on engineering. Just about any company, even if you're small, if you're involved in product design, you now have global markets and opportunities and global competition. We've therefore actually formed a center in our college called the Weidman Center for Global Leadership. It was started with a $10 million gift from the CEO of Celanese because 3/4 of their revenue come from abroad. Okay, I just want to finish up by saying some years ago I wrote a paper on what does it mean to be globally competent, and in consultation with others, this is a very broad sort of set of attributes. But here are some of the things that we came up with, that if you were global competence, this is what it would mean. I'm not going to read these. And that's not all of them. Here are some more. And my final slide is just to say we then surveyed some people from academia that work in this area as well as people from industry. And these were their top attributes. So if you're globally competent, you can appreciate other cultures. You can work in teams of ethnic and cultural diversity. That's really a big one. A lot of engineering is done in teams. You can communicate across cultures. You can practice engineering in a global context. And you can deal with ethical issues, which would get more complicated as you cross national boundaries. So those are the top 5. Okay, so I had a few other slides, but they were extras. So we'll just skip those and go to Lee's slide, I think. That'll be it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the points that you brought up, and I think especially I like the Dreamliner picture. That was great. My son-in-law was actually doing an internship with Boeing this summer and in Seattle, and so we had a chance to go take a tour of the factory where the Dreamliner was made, and it was really fun. Well, I was jealous of him because he was able to actually go down into the Dreamliner and go inside of the aircraft and see it. It was just really quite amazing. But I'd love to have the opportunity to ride in a Dreamliner. That has to be a bucket list item. If we can just get more of those in the United States. But in any event, Dreamliner is a fantastic machine. And that's the one that I like also for the very reasons you had it, and that is that it's something that brings together parts from all over the world and is really challenged by the supply chain. And to try to talk to you a little bit about this from a business perspective, instead of going through some of the same examples, which I thought were fantastic, I'll talk a little bit more about it from the standpoint of a manager or a person who's dealing in international business. And I'll mention a couple of websites that would be good for you to look at. A few years ago, we had the 50th anniversary of Title VI of the Higher Education Act, which was established to try to improve the language and cultural ability of American students. And on our side, on the business side, to help prepare the manager of the future. And so there's a website that's really quite good, and I think it's Global Competence. If you search for Global Competence, you'll come up with this website, and it was done by the Coalition for International Education. And I'd really recommend you take a look at that website because it has a lot of video clips that are interviews with people from different walks of life, people doing humanitarian service, people in the military, people in government, business people, talking about intercultural competence and why it's so important to get it and how these different programs, especially in Title VI, help people to get access to greater cultural competence. From a business standpoint, it's really interesting, fascinating, because you have some people who have deep competence in a particular area of the world, and they end up working in that area. And I think people who have Asian language ability, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, especially when you look at return missionaries, for example, have opportunities to use those in a professional setting, and oftentimes will really focus on that region of the world or that particular country. Other people, however, find that it's not necessarily a particular country that they have competence in, but it's something they can do as a business person. I have a very good friend who works for a company, for example, who has no language ability, has not lived abroad, didn't serve a foreign mission, anything like that, but he's extremely good at what he does. As a result, he travels for his company all over the world, principally Brazil, Thailand, Hong Kong, China, Korea, Japan, and even into Europe, into several countries in Europe. And he trains a lot of people in different areas that are very important for the company. And so he's had to develop a very broad set of international competence. But it would be impossible for him to learn the language of every country that he travels to. And so what he has to do is to figure out how can I be effective in these different cultures, even though I may not have the language ability. In this first slide, we were looking with our Centers for International Business at some of the future challenges that human resource managers were identifying for people they want to hire, for their fast movers, I guess you would say, in the future. And so the traditional characteristics of good managers are analytical intelligence and creative intelligence. But what you find is some of the additional characteristics that are especially critical in today's environment are cultural intelligence, the ability to work in cross-cultural environments, language ability to integrate and translate cultural cues. So that's all part of the whole area of cultural intelligence, if you will. So then, so try one other thing here, possibly. So is the key just to kind of hit it and then wait?
Just keep hitting it.
Keep hitting it until it works. There we go. So what do HR professionals themselves think? Well, the ability to work across geographies, cultures, and diverse business demands is an important skill. HR professionals need to gain self-awareness, second language, multicultural savvy to manage international work forces. This stuff is pretty obvious, and it's something you all understand, but I'll just give you a couple of very quick examples. Last spring in May, I took a group of executive MBA students to the Middle East to visit with companies, and we started off in Dubai. We got to Dubai, and I said, look, you're going to meet a lot of people in Dubai, but let me just give you one tip, which was explained to me the last time I was here. If you meet a professional woman, don't shake her hand like you would here. Wait for her to shake your hand. And the reason why is because it's such a sensitive issue, the interplay between men and women, and yet women in Dubai especially are rapidly gaining stature in the workplace in a variety of disciplines, in finance, in engineering, whatever, because women are getting better education than some of the men. They're more aggressive. The men tend to be a bit more passive, which you wouldn't expect. But it's because, things are kind of handed to them on a platter in some respects, and the women have to work for it. But they're well accepted in the workplace, especially in a city-state like Dubai. But they still are very traditional in some respects, so you have to wait and see how are they going to react to me rather than me react to them. So you just have to kind of be observant on that. Second thing we learned, we went to PepsiCo. PepsiCo has its Middle East, North Africa headquarters in Dubai. And so we had briefings by several top individuals with PepsiCo. And we found that there are 5 different individuals, all 5 came from different countries. People from the UK, from the United States, from Morocco, from, I can't even remember where else, but they were 5 different countries that were involved in setting strategy for PepsiCo in the Middle East, North Africa. And what that helps to illustrate is exactly what Dean Parkinson pointed out, and that is we work in cross-national teams. So how do you prepare yourself to work in a cross-national team? Because these individuals were all very different from each other in terms of their presentations, but they were all working with the same company, trying to achieve the same goal, and that was to be successful in the Middle East, North Africa. And then they spent a lot of time talking about how they had to adjust much of what they did for the different countries they were working in, because they all had different cultural issues. And that was all the way from the product selection, the promotion of the products, the advertising, everything they did, they had to adjust, and HR practices. So it was really interesting to listen to them talk about some of the challenges they faced trying to be successful in that very diverse region of the world. And we just replicated that in a number of other companies in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and then we went to Istanbul. Same thing. So you have a country where Islam has a very strong footprint, but which is not an Arab nation. And so you have a lot of cultural differences that make it extremely different from Dubai, even though Islam still is a strong underlying fundamental issue. So trying to navigate those waters is not a very easy thing to do. And I liked one individual, or 2 researchers, I should say, that published an article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago who said that when you're trying to deal with other cultures, you have to first of all use your head. And by head, they talked about cognitive skills. You learn as much as you can about that particular culture, but that's not enough, because all it does is give you knowledge, but it doesn't help you figure out how to work. And then they talked about the physical side, or using the body, and that has to do with a lot of the example of shaking hands is a very good one. Eye contact, proximity when you're talking to somebody, a variety of things like that. Latin Americans tend to be very warm. And I remember when we had a woman from Fundação Getúlio Vargas from Brazil that came here a year ago when we were setting up an exchange agreement with them, and she was just constantly touching everybody. Well, it's kind of hard for Americans in some respects. You know, a woman comes up and she's always grabbing your hand and talking to you, grabbing your arm and stuff like that. And it's just part of the physical, close proximity nature of Latins, and just something you have to learn. And then finally, the heart, which is more the emotional and motivational side of trying to get to know another culture. So, you know, how do I bond with other people? How do I accept who they are? And how do I figure out how best to do that? And so the hard part is trying to help students understand that in a variety of cultural settings. You know, we all tend to be very well in what we would call a provincial setting, which means if it's a country that has very narrow distance between me and them, psychic distance, and I can usually get along okay. But as that psychic distance gets bigger, then it's more complicated, because I can't figure out the cues. I don't know the language. We come from different backgrounds. It makes it a lot more complicated. And so we're constantly trying to figure out how to adjust. I'm in the midst of teaching a class right now that's on teleconference with students from Lisbon, Portugal, and Lima, Peru. So we link up with them one day a week in Lima and one day a week in Lisbon. This morning we finished up with our students in Lisbon, and they don't come from Portugal, interestingly enough, because it's a study abroad class. But they come from Estonia, Poland, Slovenia, Italy, France, the Czech Republic, China. So they're all there in that group. And then we have ours in our group, which are mostly Americans, but also a couple of students from Armenia, a student from Peru, from Brazil, from Mexico that are exchange students. And so we talked about stereotypes. What are your stereotypes of Americans? You know, don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. And then what are our stereotypes of Europeans? And then going back and forth. Fascinating experience. And it's really interesting to talk to the students after to see how much they learn just by interacting. So I guess the thing that I would tell you, which would second what Dean Parkinson said, was you need to have international experiences. So critical. And even if you're from another country, you need to have international experiences in another country that's very different, that has large psychic distance from what you're used to. So an Asian student doesn't need to go back to Asia, unless you want to go to another part of Asia, which is really different from your home country. But go to Europe, go to Latin America, go somewhere where it's very different, where you've not had that exposure before. On our website at gmc.byu.edu, you can see some of the experiences we have. We send 200 to 300 students a year out doing business study abroad programs of one form or another, or exchange programs, or internships, or whatever. But just look around for opportunities to have some great experiences abroad. So I'm excited that you're studying intercultural competence. It's not easy, but it's really a whole lot of fun. And the more experience you have outside and interacting with people from other cultures, the easier it's going to be for you. Thanks.
It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. In many ways, I don't really feel worthy of speaking on this topic. I don't have the experience that these people do, these speakers who preceded me do. But it has been interesting for me to pull together a few thoughts relating to cultural competence. What I'd like to do is take a more kind of broader global academic approach, and in fact, use some research I've developed recently and see how that ties into this issue of developing cultural competence. Okay, so I'll just, should it be pointed there or here? Or do you know where this should point? There? Okay.
Keep clicking.
Just keep clicking. Pull the trigger.
There you go.
All right. The Industrial Revolution is commonly thought of as beginning around 1820. And, well, actually, that's when global growth has commonly believed to have taken off, starting around 1820. Industrial Revolution obviously had its seeds in the 1700s. Since that time, we have seen a huge increase in globalization. The world has changed immensely. Today, the products that you buy are much more likely to have been produced overseas than 50 years ago, or certainly 150 years ago. You can work, as we've heard, for firms that can sell their products anywhere around the world. You can work with people from anywhere around the world. The money you borrow for your mortgage very likely is going to come in part from somewhere else in the world. The stocks that are sold are very often sold to foreigners or bought by foreigners. The government, of course, borrows a whole bunch of money. Much of this borrowing is not from U.S. citizens, it's from around the world. We definitely have a very globalized society now. Now, when you go to the supermarket and buy fruit, I don't know if you realize this, but the fruit that you buy could very easily have come, as fresh as it is, it could very easily have come from almost anywhere in the world. You could buy apples from New Zealand at your local grocery, apricots from China, bananas from Ecuador, okay? Grapes from Peru. So we have this entire list. Plums from Guatemala, tangerines from South Africa. Definitely a much more globalized society than perhaps even we realize, those of us who study these issues here in this room. Now, how do I go in reverse? Okay. And maybe they're helping me back there. Is that what's happening? Along with globalization has come increased prosperity and reduced poverty. Now, there's a lot of political debate about the impacts of globalization on the world, on people's lives. But economists don't agree about a lot of things. But one thing about which there's a strong consensus is that greater openness to the global economy has increased growth overall for the global economy, and along with that has reduced poverty. I'm going to go forward one and then hope I can get back. Okay, this is an interesting graph. I referred to the fact that global growth took off around 1820. Now, I think that's an interesting year if you believe in the restoration as I do, if you have a testimony of the restoration. But that's recognized by non-LDS economists as kind of a key year after which global growth took off. This is a graph of per capita income corrected for inflation. And we see, this is the economist hockey stick. And this is a good hockey stick overall, where per capita income has increased 5 times in the past 200 years or less. It was basically flat as far back as the data goes. Reasonable data on global per capita income goes back to about the year 0. Basically flat. It takes about $500 just to keep someone alive every year on these numbers. Okay, now we've increased 5 times since global growth took off. That, in many ways, coincided with globalization. Now, correlation is not causation, but again, more careful research indicates that the globalization that came along with the Industrial Revolution has reinforced and supported some growth. And I'd like to try to go backwards here. Okay, so we've had increased prosperity, reduced poverty, yet we still have a lot of poverty. And there's still concerns about the nature of capitalism and free markets and how that impacts poverty. We still have far too many children that face hunger and starvation. Can we rely on continued globalization to continue to reduce poverty? There's something in economics called the law of diminishing returns. Is it possible that we picked off the low-hanging fruit? We've picked off kind of all the gains we might reasonably get from globalization when it comes to reducing poverty and increasing prosperity? That's a question. Don't worry, I'm going to come back to cultural competence ultimately here, but let's just focus on this question. It turns out, when you're thinking about the connection between globalization and poverty, there's really 3 types of globalization. There's globalization of goods, globalization of capital, globalization of people. So we've had, since World War II especially, a great expansion in the first 2 of these types. And it's really taken off since World War II in terms of increased international trade. The goods that we buy and sell are more likely to be sold overseas or bought overseas. Capital flows have also expanded greatly, okay, from less than 5% of all capital formation being FDI to 20% of capital formation being foreign. But migration is a third aspect of globalization that really has not increased by a lot. About 20% of goods and services are sold overseas. About 20% of capital formation is likely to be overseas, or even portfolio investment, about 20%. What fraction of people do you think live outside of their native-born land? Any guesses? You just don't know, or you don't care. There's a hand. 35% you think of people live outside the country in which they were born. That's one guess. There's another. You think it's way down low, 1%. Well, it's in between the two, but it's only 3%. Okay, 3% of human beings live outside of the country in which they were born, despite all this globalization and despite the great things we're hearing about here, these engineering projects, these business projects, and the collaboration that's ongoing. Only 3% of people live outside their country of birth. So this is the third aspect of globalization that has not taken off along with those other 2 aspects. It's immigration. There are huge barriers to migration around the world. And especially rich countries have big barriers to immigration. And we've seen in a lot of the politics that concerning that here in the U.S. The U.S. is the #1 destination for migrants in the world, and we have pretty significant barriers to that. Just to give you, so we got a couple pictures here. Western Europe also has pretty strict barriers against migration. So this upper left picture is African migrants trying to get to Europe. They are undertaking a whole lot of risk to do it. Why? Economic opportunities are so much better in Europe for these people than they are in Africa. These people. These are low-skilled workers. Then we have people, of course, from Mexico or further south trying to get into the U.S. So that's a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico. You build a 20-foot wall, they're probably going to build a 21-foot ladder, or they're going to dig under it. Migration will continue to occur, no matter how much we put these barriers in place, but it does restrict migration, the barriers that we have in place. Now, it is possible, for instance, in the U.S., to become a citizen if you weren't born here. just follow the simple steps on this next slide. Okay? Now, my resolution on my picture is not all that clear. I apologize for that. But this is a flow chart that tells you how you can get a green card in the U.S. Okay? Now, I have if you want to see a readable image, I can get that to you. But there's all kinds of pathways to a green card. There's all kinds of steps and hoops and hurdles you have to go past to get that card. It is not an easy process. We severely restrict migration in the U.S. and in other rich countries, much more than we restrict trade and capital flows. Okay, so that's kind of this other aspect of globalization. The research I've done lately has tried to estimate the economic impacts of these migration barriers. And I'm finding a large reduction in GDP and a large increase in poverty as a result of rich nation migration barriers. And I'll just skim through a couple of highlights on that and then come back and wrap this up. First of all, other people have studied this issue. You don't need to really digest this slide, but other studies have looked at what would happen, very hypothetical, if we just let people work wherever they wanted to in the whole world, get rid of all migration barriers. The gains to global GDP are in this last column, on the order of 40 to 50%, 13 to 67%, another study. Another study had a wide range of assumptions and a wide range of results, but possibly more than 100% of GDP, 20 to 100%. So huge fractions of GDP are being lost by migration barriers. The reason for this is the world, you can think of it as divided up into two areas, rich and poor. There's a rich part of the world, which is Western Europe, North America, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. Per capita incomes are 20,000 or well above that. 1/5 of the world's population live in that part of the world. That part of the world represents half of the world's GDP. So half of world output is being produced by 1/5 of the people living in rich countries. The reason they can do that is because they have a much better infrastructure, much better capital available, knowledge, know-how. You have 80% of the world's people living in that other half of the world that's producing the other half of GDP. 80% of the world's people works with infrastructure that's far inferior overall to the infrastructure in the rich part of the world. Now that is changing, I recognize that. And we have lots of high-tech projects going on in the developing world. But in a huge overall sense, what we have here is a big mismatch. We have workers that are crammed into one half of the world with, frankly, inferior access to technology for many of them, not all of them. And then the other half of the world is sort of like a gated community, which is keeping migrants out, enjoying high incomes, but shrinking world GDP by a lot, because we're not letting people move where they want to move to. Let me just highlight one thing from this slide. A study by Lant Pritchett, Kennedy School professor, LDS, very interesting. He looked at wages across the world, wage gaps for equivalent workers, low-skilled workers in particular. And so there's a Bangladeshi might earn a couple dollars a day if he's lucky at working at some job. A person with those same skills, if you move to Western Europe, could earn at least $30 a day or $20 at least. There's a huge wage gap for equivalent workers depending on where you live. He finds that if you let a Bangladeshi work in Europe for 2 months, he would earn more money than from a lifetime of microcredit in Bangladesh. That comes from the fact that you can earn 10 times more in Europe than you can at home. The returns to microcredit are about 15% a year. And over a 30-year period of lifetime of working, that's actually less than a 10 times boost to your income. Now that's maybe not entirely true, and there may be some assumptions that underlie that, but the message is being able to move to work at a better place can generate a whole huge amount of income gains. All right, let me just continue on and wrap this up. So I did some simulations myself. I'm not going to focus on these, but basically I'm finding 76% boost to world income if we let workers move wherever they want to move, even if there's a $10,000 cost. So if I assume a $10,000 cost of migration for every single worker, if they could move and work where the opportunities are best, we could see a huge gain to world GDP. And, last thing from this slide, a reduction in poverty I'm estimating about 67%. I think the real payoff to more migration is it helps the poor. Now, this poverty reduction doesn't necessarily mean that the poorest of the poor are going to move to the rich world and work. But what happens is maybe the middle class of many poor countries can move, and that will create more job opportunities for the poorest of the poor to move up. And a key part of this story is education. So you assume some kind of education and skill upgrading. There'll be a huge reduction in poverty if people can move more freely. All right. Well, how does this again tie back in? I think that building cultural competence can promote freer migration around the world as we come to understand other cultures, as we come to get more comfortable with other cultures. That's going to promote more migration, I believe, and that has economic benefits on top of all the other excellent benefits that come from greater cultural harmony. A big reason why we have these migration barriers is prejudice, it's cultural conflict, it's lack of recognition of the value of interacting with people of other cultures. And I think the more that we develop cultural competence, the more we're going to be better able to break down barriers to movement, barriers to migration around the world. So I see building cultural competence from an economic point of view as actually promoting economic benefits for the global economy, in addition to all the other excellent benefits that come from that. So just to wrap this up, I add my voice to the voice of others, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, activists, who want to build cultural competence, who want to build cultural harmony around the world. I see an economic argument for doing this in addition to the other arguments. And Professor Anthony Appia, a philosophy professor at Princeton, has encouraged all of us to become cosmopolitans, a person who is a cosmopolitan. That's not an adjective, it's a noun. Cosmopolitan, someone who is genuinely at ease, moving across different cultures, but yet is secure in their own identity, their own cultural identity. And I think the more that happens, the more we can facilitate this other aspect of globalization that's been hindered. And the more we can, again, reap economic gains as well as the other personal and business and engineering gains that come from all of this. One last thought. I think one of the best ways to build cultural competence is to serve a full-time mission. Even if you go stateside, I think that is an excellent way to build cultural competence, to get thrown in with another culture. So thank you, and I encourage questions and look forward to further discussion here.